What's going on, guys? My name is Graham. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be answering the age-old question, is the upcoming NHL draft class deep or not? So if that sounds good to you guys, please do be sure to hit like, subscribe, leave a comment. All those things really help me out. With that being said, let's get into the video. As I was preparing to make this video, I realized I am not an authoritative source on this subject. So I took to Discord to ask somebody who is. Hey, Will Scouch. I'm doing a bit for a video on the 2022 NHL Draft class, and I need you to answer the following question with a yes/no. Is the 2022 draft class deep? Obviously, it's more complicated than yes/no, but that's part of the bit, and explaining the bit is also part of the bit. Yes/no? No. Well, there you have it, right? If Will says it's not a deep draft, then it's not a deep draft, right? But in all seriousness, it is more complicated than yes/no, right? Like that's not how this works. And in order to legitimately judge whether it's a deep draft or not, you kind of have to have some criteria, a benchmark, if you will. And I think an easy way of doing that is looking back at previous draft classes. So if we go back to previous draft classes, I think probably the deepest draft, at least since I've been into hockey, was the 2015 draft, right? The McDavid Eichel draft. So we're going to be comparing that draft to 2022. I think a good place to start when comparing draft classes is looking at the talent at the top of the draft. So obviously the 2015 draft, you have Conor McDavid first overall, Jack Eichel, Dylan Strome, Mitch Marner, Noah Hanifin, Pavel Zacha, Ivan Provorov, Zach Werenski, Timo Meier, and Mikko Rantanen round out the top 10. That is kind of a really stacked top 10. I mean, Rantanen going 10th overall is a huge steal in that draft, right? And so you look at that and you think of, okay, what are the guys that are going to go top 10 in the 2022 draft? Well, we don't know yet. Obviously, the draft hasn't happened. But we do know with a reasonable amount of certainty that Shane Wright is going to go first overall. So if you had to choose one of those 10 guys or Shane Wright to have on your team, that's not really a fair comparison, right? Because that draft was 7 years ago, but let's just pretend like Shane Wright has had 7 years to develop to like level the playing field a bit. But yeah, like obviously you'd take McDavid over Shane Wright. That's not a question. Eichel over Shane Wright? Yeah, I think so. That's not a question either. Rantanen? Yeah. Timo Meier? Yeah. Mitch Marner? Yeah. Zach Werenski? I think I'd take Werenski over Shane Wright too. And the rest of those guys, maybe Dylan Strome, probably not, but he had a pretty good he had a pretty good year this year. He could still develop, I guess. Who else? Provorov. I'd take Wright over Provorov, and probably Hanifin as well. But still, like, this guy's going first overall, and there's at least 5 or 6 guys in this draft class, in the 2015 draft class, that I'd rather have on my team than Shane Wright. So that kind of gives you an idea right off the top of the bat that the very top end talent isn't quite there in this draft. Another thing to look at when looking at high-end talent in a draft is how many NHL All-Stars the draft class has produced. And so far, the 2015 class has already produced 13 All-Stars, and there's a few more guys that I think are pretty likely to become All-Stars at some point in their career. Guys like Rupe Hintz, Ilya Samsonov, Lawson Krause, and maybe even a few others. Now, again, it's hard to predict how many All-Stars will come out of the 2022 draft class, but I would be very surprised if there was 13 guys that had already made All-Star game appearances 7 years from now out of this class. One benchmark a lot of people use when they're discussing how successful a prospect is going to be at the NHL level is whether or not they play 200 career games. That is what is considered a NHL regular player. The 2015 class has already produced 43 players with at least 200 career games played. And just looking over the list, there's about 20 more guys that have a very realistic chance of hitting that benchmark in the next few years, and probably a handful more that could hit that mark in their career. Personally, I would be very surprised if we saw 60 plus players in the 2022 draft class go on to have 200 career NHL games played. I think a more realistic number is probably somewhere between 45 and 50, which might not sound like a huge difference, but 60 players is a good bit more than a quarter of all players drafted. Like, that's pretty good. 50 is a little less than all drafted players, and the vast majority of those are going to be in the first round. So when you're talking about deep drafts, you're really getting a lot more regular NHL players outside the first round, and we saw that with the 2015 class. There was 63 players. That's like 2 full rounds worth. Keep in mind, back in 2015, there was only 30 teams, so that's actually more than 2 full rounds worth of players. That's very deep. This draft, you get 50. That's like, if you consider if all the first rounders hit that mark, then you're looking at 18 more guys. So that's like a little more than half of the second round. Generally speaking, though, having 10 to 15 less players becoming full-time NHL players in a draft class is a pretty big deal in my eyes. Finally, the last thing I want to go over is this year's top 10. Obviously, the draft hasn't happened yet, so we don't know exactly who's going to go top 10, and I'm not going to try to predict that right now. What I will do is list my current top 10 ranked players. So some of these guys, one of these guys in particular, is definitely not going to get drafted in the top 10, but I think these are the 10 best players in the draft. Shane Wright, Brad Lambert, Logan Cooley, Matthew Savoie, Gleb Trikozov, who is definitely not going in the first round, Yurov Slavkovsky, Simon Nemec, David Jurchek, Liam Ogren, and Frank Nazar. And we already went over the top 10 from the 2015 draft class, and if you compare those two groups, even projecting some of these guys to get close to their ceilings, I think that 2015 group beats them pretty handily. Now that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please do like it, subscribe, leave a comment. Again, all those things really help me out, and I will see you in the next video.